Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is Matt Gayer, Co-Executive Director at the Catalog for Philanthropy. We'll be talking about Effective Solicitation Day, how to gain support. So we'll get started here in just a second. We're going to give folks just another minute to hop on the line, then we'll get started. Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. For those of y'all that just hopped on, my name is Matt Gayer, Executive Director here at the Catalog for Philanthropy. We'll be talking about Effective Solicitation Day and how to gain support. A couple of things to note before we begin. You should be able to see our screen right now, hear our audio. If you have issues with either of those, just let us know. We'll try to fix those as quickly as we can. We will send out a copy of the slides and recording shortly afterwards, so you will receive a copy of the slides and recording shortly after the webinar today. If you have any questions throughout, feel free to ask those at any time. In the question box, we'll answer those as they come up or at the end of the webinar today. So we think about effective solicitation, right? We're thinking about both how we tell our story and how we connect to our audience. And it really should be audience driven. So a couple of things to note before we get into some specific details and kind of tips and tricks here is just thinking about where are donors right now? What are donors kind of thinking about feeling? The first thing is that we're really seeing donors more than ever have a strong desire to have a sense of impact from making their gift. They want to feel like their giving, and through that, your work is making a real difference in the community. Now, that does not mean necessarily it has to be a very stats heavy approach, right, with a bunch of data. Could be a bunch of impactful stories that you're sharing. But because of everything going on in the world, because of the last few years, a lot of people are feeling frustrated or they lack hope right now, right? They want to see some progress. They want to feel that sense of progress and difference. And that's something that we see organizations can provide. We will send the slides recording shortly after the webinar, so you will receive both the slides and recording. Don't feel like you have to take copious notes during it. Secondly, while we see donors want that impact, why isn't that just translating into this kind of surge of giving? Donors are overwhelmed, right? There's a lot going on personally, professionally for them, probably the same as it is for us. They're in a generally good place right now. Most donors, we've seen their kind of giving capacity remain relatively flat, but there's a lot of uncertainty in the space, right? There's talks of a recession. Inflation continues, right? A lot of the things they buy at the grocery store are more expensive than they used to be. A lot of jobs are more precarious than they used to be. So while the donors are not yet, in many cases, actually feeling any type of negative economic impact, they're thinking about it, right? And that uncertainty, that concern impacts their giving behavior. And also just adds stress, right? Even if that doesn't cause them to give less, it's just one more thing for them to think about. So we see a lot of donors struggling to think about their long-term strategic giving right now. And they're kind of just head down, wanting to do things day to day. That's why we see kind of this last piece be true for them, is a real focus on what's happening on the ground, quote unquote. Wanting to know what's actually going on in the community. What does education look like post-COVID? What does public housing look like in a world of rising costs, right? They want to feel connected to their community. They want to be a part of their community, and they want to be aware of what's happening in the community. And all of that is pointing to more and more hyper-local giving. Donors supporting in the community that they live or work, which as kind of small community-based organizations bodes well for our fundraising efforts. The final thing I'll say as we go into the solicitation tips here that I'll share in just a second is that we are seeing major donors really step up, give in really generous ways, and give more than they have before. We actually saw a 20% decline nationally in 2022 of smaller gifts. So people giving that kind of $250 and below, $100 and below, right? Grassroots giving dropped by about 20%. Middle level donors did drop, not by quite that much, but still a pretty significant amount. So we see organizations either trying to fight that trend and re-engage the broad base of donors giving lower, or leaning into that trend, really trying to engage those major donors. So when we think about some specific kind of tips and tricks here, we'll go through 5 tips that kind of relate back to 3 themes. And the first theme is the relationship. One of the biggest shifts we've seen with individual donors over the last 5 years is a real escalation in how much they want their giving to feel relational. They don't want this to feel like an ATM, right? That once a year you ask them for cash, they pay it, and that's it. They really want to feel connected to the work, to the mission, and to you. So we need to let them know that we care, right? The majority of donors that stop giving to an organization stop giving for one of 2 reasons. It's either because they feel like they don't matter to the nonprofit, or they feel like they're gifted and make a difference. We know that's not true, so it's about how we're communicating and relating to them. The first thing is, if we're going to a donor who has given before, we want to make sure that that new solicitation begins with gratitude. Right, so if I'm going to a donor who's given to me before and I'm making the ask for this year and they haven't given yet this year, I want to make sure that in that pretty early on, if it's not the first thing I do, it's pretty early in the first third of the letter, third part of the appeal, the talk I'm giving, whatever, that pretty early on, I'm thanking them for their past support to get us to here, because I want them to know I'm recognizing that they've been a part of our journey. Right, and donors want to feel that, not feel like this is just a unique gift they're giving this time, a transactional kind of point in time. They want to feel like this is part of an ongoing relationship, right? So this is how we can make a nod to that long term. So make sure we're leading with gratitude when we make a new solicitation. It's also going to help to remind them the difference they made, right? Because if I say, hey, thanks for giving them last year, you got us to this year, and look at all we did last year, it also reminds them of the impact their gift made. So they feel like by donating, they're making a true difference. And we want to drive that home for them. If they haven't given, or if in addition to giving, they've done other things, we want to make sure that's being thanked as well, right? So we're thanking them for their attending an event, for volunteering. Maybe they participated in some type of advocacy campaign we did. Maybe they brought someone to an event. But as much as we can, thanking them for those things. That could be individual. Obviously, if it's a major donor. If it's a mass appeal we're sending, we could, for instance, segment out. This is why we often recommend segmenting out those people that attended our gala, right, our annual fundraising event, or segment out volunteers so that in their specific email appeal that's going out to our 100 volunteers or 200 gala guests, it can thank them for doing that thing, right? Thanks for volunteering. Now I'm going to ask you for support. Thanks for going to the event. Now I'm going to ask you for support. Again, it's recognizing them as a whole person, not just as a financial donor. And that's what we see a lot of donors want these days, right? They want to feel like a supporter of the organization, not just a donor of the organization. And then finally, even if it's a pure prospect, right? So someone I got a couple of lunches with and now I'm making the ask, someone that signed up for a newsletter, right? I haven't talked to, but they're getting a mass appeal from me. I want to still put in that letter at some point, thanking them for their interest and or time. I want to include gratitude in my solicitation always, even if they haven't done anything other than be willing to get this letter, right? Even if it's a cold letter we're sending, thanking them at the end for their time to read the letter. They may or not, excuse me, they may or may not read it, but if they do, we want them to feel that sense of gratitude. In general, people will give more when they feel thanked previously, right? It reminds them of the relationship. It's something that we're giving them a sense of impact by giving them that gratitude, and then they're more likely to give more generously to us. The second tip here still relates to relationships with donors, and it's really trying to get a little more personal. So what this looks like, a couple things, and again, these actually apply all the mass appeals. Obviously, we're meeting one-on-one with a major donor. We can get a lot more personal, a lot quicker, and that's a little more direct. But if we're thinking about a mass appeal and how we can make this solicitation that's going out to hundreds or thousands of people still feel personal, there's a couple of things we can do to help us get a little ahead of that. One is we want to make sure that we're not just asking our supporters for money. If the only thing they get from us all year is a bunch of informational newsletters, and then 1 to 3 times a year we send an email asking for cash, that's going to feel pretty transactional, right? A lot of times. It's going to feel like we're just like kind of giving them some info, keeping them engaged, and then asking for money. Instead, ideally, before we ask for money from either a new prospect or from a donor during that year, we're asking them to do something else. It could be volunteer, it could be some type of advocacy, and to be clear on advocacy, that could be as small as like forward this newsletter to a friend of yours you think would be interested in our work, right? Share our social media posts on your page. It doesn't have to be something big or political, it could be personal advocacy. Could just be learn more. Click here to read more about the underlying social issue we work on. It could be taking a personal action. We're an environmental group. We're asking you to switch your light bulbs to better light bulbs or start a home recycling program. And then obviously kind of along with the advocacy piece, could just be to share the information with someone. Why we're asking them to do this stuff is that even if they don't do any of those things, right? So, we often advise in every email you send to donors that has information with it, your newsletter, et cetera, there should be some type of ask in there, either to learn more, share, advocate, volunteer, et cetera. And why we're doing that is even if they do none of that during the year, when we finally ask for money at some point, they're going to feel like it's just one more thing we're asking for, not that we're only asking for money. It makes them feel like we value all the ways they could contribute, even if the only way they contribute is money, right? Now, obviously, for some of our major donors, some of our older donors, we may want to keep it with lighter touches, right, and just the kind of financial ask. But in general, most donors want to hear from us at least monthly. And getting them the habit that I'm going to send information and ask for something makes it more likely they say yes to that financial solicitation, at the end of the year or kind of halfway through the year. The more personalization we can have in our mass appeal, the better. So things that are, seemingly small, but like mail merging in their first name to the email. So it says, hi Matt versus like hello. That makes people more likely to give. Trying to again segment a little bit again about who attended an event, or if they're an alumni of the program, or if they gave consistently for the last 5 years. If we can segment out and have something in there that feels to them like it actually applies to them and not to everyone in the world, they're going to be a lot more likely to engage. And we see that kind of personalization becomes more and more important as emails have just proliferated, right? As people are getting dozens of fundraising appeals during kind of popular solicitation times, one way we can stand out is that personalization in any small way we can do it. And then finally, really making sure that we're thinking about the audience we're sending this to, whether we segment it or not, and making sure the solicitation is tied to something material that's going to matter to them, right? So we're doing a fundraising campaign at back to school, talking about how we're doing this to make sure that all students can feel prepared, engaged, and excited for the start of the school year, right? Want to tie it back to something that they can relate to. That they're going to feel kind of connected to. It doesn't have to be a concrete thing, right? It's not like we always have to fundraise money to buy X, Y, or Z thing, or to provide specifically, a meal a day for a student. It could just be that we want to provide the support to make sure all students can be excited about starting the school year, right? That gets that donor thinking about their kids starting the school year, gets them thinking about themselves when they used to start the school year. And either of those is going to help personalize it for them, make them feel more connected. The third tip here, and this gets to a different piece, is really thinking about the message of your solicitation, right? So what are we actually saying when we're making a fundraising appeal? And our goal here is to really balance both the proof that we do good work and then also this emotional connection, right? The head and the heart are the two pieces of our solicitation that we're always working to balance. And ideally, they're supporting each other, right? So the head is going to be more the stats, more the proof points, the logic behind what we do, really trying to prove to people that an investment in us is going to make a real difference in the community, where the heart is much more the emotional, personal connection, the understanding of the intrinsic value of the work, is going to hopefully get them kind of feeling excited, hopeful, optimistic, etc. And those feelings are going to lead to more giving. The interesting thing is that typically you take kind of 10 people thinking about donating to a nonprofit, 6 will make their first gift because of the stat, because of that head connection, whereas 3 will make their first gift because of an emotional connection, that heart connection. But the 3 will give more than the 6 collectively. And why that's important to remember is that it's rare you talk to someone giving at a significant level to an organization simply because of stats, right? They need some of that story and they need some of that connection to really get to that major level. But a lot of times those stats, those proof points, the logical kind of flow of our work and our impact and how we talk about that is what gets people engaged in the first place, right? It's a good program, so they give a little bit, and then they realize how much they care about the program, and then they give a lot. Right, so we want to make sure we have both of those in our appeal. Some of the things we're thinking about when writing that message these days that we see really engaged donors right now. One is that we want to make sure that appeal is relatable, right? So using numbers and stats that people can understand and connect with. It is a lot more powerful for a donor to hear that you're providing, 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, to a client versus we serve 1 million meals a year. 1 million meals, I can't necessarily think about what 1 million is, right? It's a really big number. That's hard for me to kind of conceptualize. So I want to make sure that we're using numbers that people are going to identify with and feel connected to. The more visual the number, the better. Secondly, if I'm thinking about stories on the other side of this, I want to make sure those stories are really character driven, that people are really going to connect with the story that I'm telling there. As we see, that's really important for them to kind of feel part of that story themselves, right? And to really kind of see themselves in the impact. And then the question we often get from folks is, should I be doing stories or stats? And the answer is both and together. Stories and stats are strongest when they're actually supporting each other. So thinking about, for instance, we serve 100 students. On typical, we increased their reading level by 1.5 grades, and here's what that meant for this individual student, right? Or, this individual client, here's the story, and they're just one of 200 clients who typically, 87% have gainful employment for at least 2 years after the program. Putting those stats and stories together so people either see the big picture stat and then a specific example, or a specific example, and they can blow that out to the big picture impact, is going to be where we see the most impact from our stats and stories. And then finally, on stats or stories, we want to make sure we're staying really authentic with what we're sharing there. A lot of times, especially some of our younger donors, are going to realize and know that 100% of our clients have perfect lives after participating in the program is not realistic, right? It's not possible. So kind of trying to pick those stats that are a little too good to be true, trying to put a story out there that, everything's perfect now because this person participated. That's a really traditional way, right, of doing a lot of fundraising appeals that we know both has some real equity concerns to it, but also just we see donors want that more authentic piece now. And they can kind of tell when we're kind of pitching them versus kind of reporting on what's actually happening. So trying to lean into that authenticity when we think about our storytelling, but also when we think about our stats that we're sharing. The fourth tip here still relates back to that second theme, which is around that solicitation message, which is that we really want to make sure that we're giving something back to the donors in a solicitation. And that may sound confusing because typically when we think about asking someone for money, it's that we're asking, they're giving, but we're also giving something back, right? We're giving a sense of identity, we're giving an emotion, we're giving a way for them to kind of self-actualize and make a difference in the community, which might be something that's very important to them and who they think they are. So we want to think about what is that emotional benefit, that personal identity benefit we're giving back to a donor, and that's going to change how we make our solicitation and what we think about in writing a really effective fundraising appeal. So the first part is about the emotional motivation of a donor that we're giving back. A lot of times when thinking about fundraising appeal, we have two options, right? We can either go doom and gloom, everything's really bad, everything's falling apart, we need your support to possibly try to keep it together, or we can go positive, right? Hope, change, progress, support us, we're doing great work, wins are happening in the community, we need your support to keep doing those wins in an even bigger, more sustainable way. What we see often, when we think about kind of fundraising campaigns we've seen from national nonprofits, a lot of times international NGOs, they tend to be really negative. Why do they do that? Because negative emotions do get donations faster, but it's a smaller donation, and the donor retention on those, so the number of donors that come back and give again to those organizations, is incredibly small. Now, major nonprofits, international, national organizations do that because they're sending out to millions of people. They don't have to care about donor retention necessarily, right? They're just trying to get some small level donations in the door. Why that happens is because psychologically, for a donor, if it's a negative appeal, they're giving to get away from that sad feeling. But that means when you come back to them again, they associate your organization with those sad, fear-filled feelings, and they're less likely to donate again because they don't want to feel sad and fearful. On the other side, if you do positive emotions, your donor retention is much higher, right? They, again, subconsciously, psychologically tie your organization as supporting you to positive emotions, right? To hope, to progress, to change. And those are all things that are going to make it more likely they give again in the future, also more likely to give at a higher level. So for us, working with a smaller donor list, needing that kind of donor retention to be pretty high, we want to stay positive on the emotions that we're creating there. We can still create urgency, right, for the donor. We can still say, this is a critical need right now, a critical opportunity. We can still put deadlines on things. We can still talk about how big the need is, but overall, we want the act of giving to be one of hope, one of progress, and not one of like stopping something bad. We really want to use some emotive language there. That's one way we can do this. If we're telling a story, really kind of setting the scene of that story, giving some context. We want people to feel that personal connection to the work. Secondly, the second thing we can give a donor, we teach a different webinar solely on this topic, so we can dive into this more if you're interested on our Learning Commons portal. But it's giving donors a sense of identity, right? So when donors give, they do so in part, consciously or subconsciously, to take on a certain identity, right? They think of themselves in a slightly different way as they're someone who's making a gift, right? They're giving because they want to be an agent of change, right? They want to cause a difference in the community. These are people who really want to see the impact they're giving. We see a lot of people give as a form of protest. They're upset about national dialogue about a topic. They're upset about politics and policies about a certain topic. They're upset by structural injustice, and the way they're kind of fighting back against that, or one of the ways, is supporting your work, right? So they see that as a form of protest. We see other folks that are more just that helper, right? They think giving and supporting is a good thing, and they're a good person, so they want to do good things, right? So these are going to be people who, again, really want to hear those personal stories and those personal kind of impact stories that we have as an organization. So thinking about what our donors might want, what drives their giving, and then using that to really kind of make sure that they see themselves as a donor there, right? And often we're using nouns there specifically to give donors identity. So saying that, our supporters are true agents of change, right? By elevating our work, they are helping the people in the community, right? Whatever it might be, but using some verbiage there to give them that identity and connection. And then finally, we mentioned this kind of at the very outset, but donors really want to see that community impact right now, that difference that's being made. At the end of the day, the vast majority of donors are giving to make a difference, right? And they want to know kind of what's going to happen because of their gift. So wanting to make sure we put front and center in both our solicitation and then afterwards our stewardship, what that impact is going to be. And then finally, we want to make sure that that solicitation doesn't feel out of left field, right? So when we ask for money, especially if it's a newer donor, they're also going to be considering what they've seen on our website, what they've seen on our social media, what they heard at our event. And that solicitation needs to build on those other things, right? So when we think about a fundraising campaign, when we think about a theme for the year for engaging our donors, it's because we want it all to feel cohesive, right? Our brand and our kind of story should feel connected across our website, social, emails, related materials, events. It doesn't always have to be identical, but the core kind of underlying theme, right, the purpose should feel the same. So when they get that solicitation in December, if they attended our event in October, it doesn't feel like two totally different organizations or two totally different focuses, right? We want them to feel connected. So that cohesion is really important to building trust and to getting engagement when the solicitation occurs. And again, not everything we do across the year has to be exactly about this one thing, but it should feel aligned. It should feel like we're building on ourselves and our communications. So it's really vital to have a communications calendar, which at the very least, right, not all of us have time to do by week or day by day on what that calendar is going to be, but at least look at your months across the year and have a theme for each month, right? And a theme that hopefully builds to in November and December. My theme is I do great work, support me. And if I want to get there in November and December, what do I have to do June to October to have people believe that message, right? So making sure we're building on ourselves across the year. And then finally, I'll just say on that online experience part, I think people are really conscious of this on social media, making sure they're thinking about what they're posting to drive that engagement. We often neglect our websites. So our social media might be really updated. Our email campaigns are amazing. Our direct mail campaigns really strong, but our website hasn't been updated in 5 years, right? If people go there and see that, it doesn't just look like a bad website. It does change the level of trust in the organization. So it's important to make sure that that website, at least twice a year, is getting some new content. You don't have to like rebuild the thing, but add a couple blog posts, change out a picture, right? Something that's going to make people feel like it's dynamic. Is going to help create that brand cohesion. So finally, a couple of next steps, and then I'll pause for any questions you all have. Making sure we're thanking donors that gave at the end of the year and giving an update. Why that's a solicitation to do is I need to do the stewardship first, so I'm ready for my next round of solicitation, right? I want to think about what's that real world impact of the ask I'm making, right? The difference a donor making is not just adding money to my budget, right? The difference they're making is something in the real world, so I want to make sure they know that, so identifying what that impact is. Identifying what identity, what emotions you want to give to a donor, making sure we have stats and stories collected now so that when we need them for fundraising appeals, we have them. Auditing our digital brand, especially social media, emails, and website to make sure they're cohesive and they build on each other. And then finally, updating our communications as our performance and context continues to shift, especially context in the community. With that, I'll pause for any questions you all have for a wrap up. All right, great. Well, thank you all for joining. We'll send out the slides and recording shortly afterwards. Have a good rest of the day.